Hello, my name is Ari. I'm an aspiring author, and on this channel we talk about all things writing, reading, and overthinking, and if you're not new here, welcome back. Today I want to talk about something that is super common, but in my opinion is not talked about enough, and that is imposter syndrome for writers. Whether you're a new writer or you're an established author, maybe working on your 5th, 6th, 10th, whoever knows how many books, or maybe you're someplace in between, I would say the chances might be high that at one point you've experienced a nagging voice in your head that said, "Who am I to call myself a writer?" So in this video, I want to talk about what imposter syndrome might look like for writers, why so many of us deal with it, and some tips and tricks that I've found that help me move forward. I also want to start with a disclaimer. I am not a mental health professional, but I have in the past, and I do experience imposter syndrome, but the way that it manifests for me and the way that I experience it might be different from the way that you might experience it. So let's start with a definition of imposter syndrome, and I'm going to read it because I don't want to mess it up. According to Google, imposter syndrome is the persistent inability to believe that one's success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts or skills. Another definition, which is more specific to writing, is imposter syndrome is the feeling of being a fraud despite evidence to competence. It can cause feelings of inadequacy, self-doubt, and a fear of failure. These feelings can make it difficult for writers to share their work. In other words, imposter syndrome is the feeling that you don't belong, you're not good enough, or you're somehow faking it and tricking people into believing good things about you, while also believing that you're a fraud, but everybody else knows what they're doing, but you don't. It's a voice that might say, and yes, these are all things that I've said to myself, you don't have a book published, you don't work hard enough, you're not a real writer, you're never going to be good enough. Why bother trying? It's at this point in the video that I want to refer you to a quote from Maya Angelou, okay? The world famous Maya Angelou once said, "I have written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're going to find out now. I've run a game on everybody and they're going to find me out." If someone as prolific and legendary as Maya Angelou can feel this way, I think it really goes to show just how deep-seated imposter syndrome can really be for writers. For some people, and for me personally, it can manifest as doubting your ideas, doubting your ability to execute something to a particular skill level, comparing yourself to others, struggling to show people your work because you're worried that once somebody sees what you've written, they're finally gonna find out that yes, you are a fraud. Or it can turn into writer's block and turn into avoiding writing altogether because of that kind of negative feedback loop that it creates internally, where you feel bad about writing and then it becomes a really negative and unpleasant experience because of those thoughts. I experienced imposter syndrome a lot in grad school, so not exactly writing related, but career related, where I had thought that I had tricked people into thinking that I was smart and I didn't deserve a position in the program. I would never be good enough at any of the work that I did, and it turned into a really vicious procrastination cycle where I didn't want to do any work because it felt like I was a fraud and like anything that I did wouldn't be good enough, and why even bother? Because I believed so strongly that I had just like tricked people into thinking that I could do it, even though like deep down I knew that I couldn't. And the thing that's so tricky about imposter syndrome is it's really hard to wrestle with yourself mentally, especially when those feelings can be so deeply ingrained and internalized, because those types of thoughts that you have about yourself can also be really difficult to talk about to even the people that are closest to you. And so what winds up happening is you keep it all inside, and then it just kind of starts to fester and build, and you start to believe it more and more because you don't have anybody to bounce those thoughts off of for them to even tell you like, no, you're wrong. Like, that's not true. Different things can also exacerbate imposter syndrome. So for example, during my PhD, I think my imposter syndrome was like really bad, particularly because my parents are immigrants. They never went to college, but they worked so hard to provide me and my siblings with an excellent education so that I even could be in a position where I could go get a PhD. But here I was surrounded by other students whose parents were doctors and lawyers and professors. And I came into the program feeling like I had so much less knowledge and experience than so many of these other students. But to switch that to something more writing related, there are other things that like might exacerbate it, like I often think I don't have a writing degree, so I automatically must know less about the craft, and I automatically must be a worse writer than somebody who does have a writing degree. Or maybe you feel like because you didn't start writing at 12 years old, like what's the point of even starting now? Maybe you picked up writing for the first time years down the line and you're kicking yourself for not starting earlier. There are so many different things and reasons and excuses that imposter syndrome latches onto to root itself in your head and to convince you that it's valid, when in reality it's not valid. I also think different genres can potentially exacerbate imposter syndrome in writing. For example, writers in like niche or experimental genres may feel they're less legitimate compared to authors in more mainstream genres. I don't remember who, but I think it was a fantasy author say that she'd had authors who did not write fantasy put down fantasy as a genre because they thought it was less legitimate than, like literary fiction. And I think you can get into this really tricky territory of elitism and genre, which also can all be baked into forms of imposter syndrome that you may experience. So why is imposter syndrome common? I think that it can be for a variety of different reasons. I think writing can be something that is so deeply personal. So when you create a story, even if you're not self-inserting, you're still putting a little bit of yourself out on a page, and that can feel very vulnerable. And on top of that, it's really easy to conflate the success of your work with your self-worth or your self-esteem. And that is because you're putting so much of yourself into your story. It's scary if somebody doesn't like what you've put on the page. It can kind of feel like somebody doesn't potentially like you, but that's actually not the case at all. Your work is not your self-worth. It is something that you're creating, yes, and of course you want to put the time and the energy and the love, but inevitably there's always going to be people who don't resonate with something that you've written, and that is just because writing is subjective and people are allowed to have different tastes, and just because your writing might not be somebody's cup of tea doesn't mean that you're not somebody's favorite author. And I think on top of all of that, we come into contact with polished, published pieces of work every single day. And we interact with pieces of work that are the result of professional editing teams and people who are seasoned in the publishing industry, which can make our early drafts feel very inadequate. Even in the AuthorTube space, like yes, you have more access to people's writing, especially like early drafts, and you can see a little bit more of the nitty-gritty process and the struggle of putting together a published piece of work, but no one is putting out the work that they are least proud of on display, even on YouTube. So it's so easy to be in your head and to see this rough draft, compare it to maybe somebody on AuthorTube or somebody's published work, and it's really easy to like put yourself down because of that. And it's so easy to compare your rough draft with somebody's final project and think, wow, I'll never be that good. But that's just a rough draft. You're working with a rough draft. You're not working with a polished, edited piece. And social media generally, I think, can really amplify it too. People post their successes, and yes, some people will post the struggle, but some people aren't posting like their deepest, darkest moments on the internet. And social media just generally tends to amplify comparison culture. And something I have to be really careful of is curating my social media feed and limiting my time to YouTube and Instagram, and try to amplify those supportive communities that you are a part of. I'm somebody who struggles with my mental health just as a baseline. And with imposter syndrome, like some people also just might be a little bit more predisposed to it than others. And if you are experiencing imposter syndrome, maybe it's similar to what I've said and what I've said has really resonated with you, or maybe it's a little bit of a different flavor of imposter syndrome. It's okay that you're experiencing it. Don't make yourself feel bad that you have those thoughts. They're really common and they're really normal. And also, imposter syndrome can be so sneaky. It's so sneaky. It can be so hard to tell what the line is between what you genuinely believe about yourself and what imposter syndrome is. They tend to like merge together until your self-perception is completely warped. Because what is having good self-esteem? We don't know her. So if you are or have experienced imposter syndrome, from the bottom of my heart, I really empathize. You're not alone. It's tough and it is not easy to deal with. But I am not going to end the video here because that would be depressing. So let's talk about some of the things that you can do to help combat imposter syndrome. And I say combat because I don't think that there's really a cure for it. Like I think some ways, or there are some tools and techniques that you can use to maybe try to minimize the voices, but I think a lot of these tips and tools are ways to kind of counteract and to tell that voice like, no, you're stupid, shut up. So tip number 1 is to recognize when imposter syndrome is showing up. Ask yourself, are you really being honest with yourself? Is where you're coming from imposter syndrome? Do you actually really believe those thoughts? Or is that the truth? So take a moment, like think about it. I often feel like I have to write down the negative thoughts because I have a really hard time like pausing internally and like having a dialogue with myself. So sometimes I'll like write down what I think. And when I write it down or I say it out loud, then I'm like, oh, that's really messed up of me to think about myself. Also, something that is helpful is when I'm doubting myself, I remind myself that many writers often experienced imposter syndrome. Like take that quote from Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou experienced imposter syndrome. And I try to remind myself, if I know that this is something that I struggle with, I know I have imposter syndrome, I know I struggle with those internal thoughts, but if I struggle with that, I also know that that means that my self-perception of myself is skewed. So that I shouldn't really always trust those internal voices in my head, even if the chatter does feel really loud. It kind of like builds in this little like distrust to those voices in your head where you can go from like fully believing all of those things about yourself to a little bit like I hear you, but I don't know if I agree. And that's actually a really huge shift if you just start to kind of stop trusting some of those mean voices in your head. And I think that's because once you recognize that imposter syndrome is actually like in the building, it's a little bit easier to reframe those negative thoughts. Okay, tip number 2 is focus on the process, not on the outcome. I will say this is absolutely easier said than done. I know this tip rationally, but I still have a really hard time doing it. I know it's hard, but try to stop worrying about the future. Try to let go of the worry of if your work is good enough to get published and try to focus on the next 5-10 minutes, the next hour. Focus on improving your skills and telling the story that you want to tell instead. And try to take each stage of the process as it comes. I like to think about it as try not to let the horse That's not right. I like to think about it as try not to let the cart before the horse. Don't worry about querying if you have to finish your book. Don't worry about getting it published if you need to get an agent. You know, like one step at a time. Don't worry 5 steps ahead because you're not there yet. There's no use in worrying about it yet. And writing, like, yes, of course, it's going to be amazing when you get a book published and it's going to be amazing to have people like your book. But most writers spend most of their time writing. It's less about enjoying the fact that you have a book published or people are celebrating your work or things like that. Like most writing, like what it actually is writing. So just like enjoy the writing, get lost in the writing, and just try to sink in. Okay. Now, tip number 3, create a wins journal or a compliment journal. And I know this sounds so cheesy, but it actually really helps. So write down every achievement, no matter how small. You finished a chapter, you finished a draft, you got feedback from a critique partner and they really liked your work, or you sat down to write when you really didn't feel like it. Celebrate the small victories. They'll remind you of progress even when it feels like there's no progress being made. For a compliment journal, I actually have a little Google Doc where I literally take screenshots. This sounds crazy, but I take screenshots of like all the nice things that people have said about my work from beta readers, or I shared an excerpt here or there, whatever it is. I post a screenshot in my little Google Doc and I have them just like all condensed in one little place. And I've done this actually a couple of times now where if I'm feeling really bad about my writing, I'll actually go into my Google Doc and I'll like scroll through it and be like, okay, maybe not all hope is lost. It's a really great reminder that there's goodness in what I'm doing, and even when I'm down in the dumps, it's a really great way to motivate me to keep going. And the last and final tip is find your writing community. If there's anything that I know about imposter syndrome, is that it thrives in isolation. It loves being alone. It loves bouncing around in your head and convincing you of things that are not true. I struggled with imposter syndrome for a really long time, and the moment that I started talking about it with people that I love and that I trust, it's really important. Talk about it with people that love you and support you and are not going to make you feel bad about yourself. Like that is key. But the moment that I started talking about it with, people I felt safe with, actually the first time I was able to get a label for how I was feeling, that it was imposter syndrome. Like before, I didn't know that it was a thing even really, but I started talking about it with people that I trusted and I felt safe with. That was the moment that it kind of stopped feeling quite so heavy. Like it felt like I wasn't carrying this deep, dark secret anymore. And I think that really goes to show what the power is of like opening up and connection. And I think a lot of writers can feel this way and it can be really insidious. But if you connect with other people who experience similar things, connect with other writers and talk about it. Yes, it takes some vulnerability. Yes, it's extremely scary to open up like that. But I think it's really important to not give the imposter syndrome the space in your head to stew and to fester, because it's really easy to convince yourself of something when you're the only person you're having a conversation with. So like, open up the conversation, you know, let somebody tell you like, no, you're wrong. Finding connection, finding community, it can be through social media, it can be through a local writers group, or it can even be here in the comment section below. Find the people who will cheer you on, find the people that you can confide in. And maybe it's not a writer, maybe it's a loved one that you feel safe with, that you know that you can confide in, but don't let the imposter syndrome stew in your head. Talk about it. And go ahead, feel free, comment down below. Do you experience imposter syndrome? We're building a community here, and that means celebrating the highs, but it also means getting through the lows together. And it's easier to get through the lows together when we can lean on each other. So those are my tips, and I want to leave you with a last thought. Remember that because of the fact that you're writing, you are a writer, okay? You're writing. That makes you a writer. Don't let imposter syndrome hold you back from the stories that you want to tell. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. What helps you deal with imposter syndrome? As always, thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.